Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives, where we take a look at current events through the lens of American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is focused on presidents flirting with a third term. President Donald Trump has been musing aloud about a potential third term for his presidency, despite the constitutional prohibition against that. The 22nd Amendment passed about 75 years ago in the wake of Franklin Roosevelt's fourth term elected into the White House. He helped guide the country through the Great Depression and World War II, but after that, the country basically said no more. We don't want that kind of a thing in the United States, and they actually passed the 22nd Amendment, the first line of which says no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. Now, I'll leave it to others to parse some of these terms, elected versus served versus eligible. If you look at the 12th Amendment, others can focus on that. We're going to focus on the history. And for that, on presidential terms, we're going to go back to the Constitutional Convention where everything started. At that convention, the initial proposal for the presidency was to serve a single term, 7 years in length, not renewable. But as things changed at the convention over the course of that summer in 1787, this is one of the things that changed. And by the time the final product came out, the presidency was limited to 4 years for a term, but there was no limit on the number of terms. It could be renewed as many times as the American people wanted. Well, that's what came out, and it had some detractors, including Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson is not at the Constitutional Convention. He's overseas in Europe. He's the minister to France, and when he gets the new Constitution, his reaction is he called himself a neutral on the document, mainly because there were two things that he really didn't like. One was the lack of a Bill of Rights, and the other, well, the second feature I dislike and dislike greatly, Jefferson wrote, is the abandonment in every instance of the necessity of rotation in office, and most particularly in the case of the president. Experience concurs with reason in concluding that the first magistrate will always be reelected if the Constitution permits it. He is then an officer for life. That was not a good thing in Jefferson's mind. So what was the country's answer to this? It was George Washington. Washington, who set so many precedents in his being the first president of the United States, he actually set this precedent beginning, though, a little bit earlier when he stepped down from power at the end of the Revolutionary War. The general, who could easily have been a king, says, no, I'm resigning my commission. I've done my job. Let's hand this off to somebody else. A move that was so unusual, so strange to the leaders in Europe that King George said if he does that, he'll be the greatest man in the world. Well, George Washington stepped down from power not once, but twice. In 1796, when his second term as president is coming to an end, he made it very clear he's not going to be a candidate for a third term, establishing a precedent that would not be breached for over 140 years. That doesn't mean that some didn't flirt with the idea of a third term. In fact, some even tried to get it, and we'll tell you those stories here, beginning with Ulysses Grant. This is in the 1870s. Now, Grant's second term was a little difficult. He had a bunch of cabinet corruption. He also had an economic panic that he was dealing with, but he was still very popular, and it was pretty clear that he could have had a third term if he ran and wanted it. He didn't. In fact, he had to do with some dealings at home, because the one person who was really pushing him, maybe more than anyone else, was his wife, Julia. She loved being first lady. She wanted more time in the White House. Eventually, Grant had to tell his wife, well, I don't want to be here another 4 years. I do not think I could stand it. Don't bother about it. I beg you. Finished off his second term, handed the presidency to Rutherford, and then he and Julia and a small entourage went on a world tour. They were gone, traveling the world really for the next couple of years. But when he comes back, arriving by ship into San Francisco, he's getting a hero's welcome and popular outpourings of emotion from across the country as Grant made his way back to the East Coast. And people were starting to think, well, maybe we should run Grant in 1880 to get him back in the presidency. And one of the leaders of this was Roscoe Conkling. Roscoe Conkling, senator from New York, was the boss of the political machine in New York, who had done really well when Grant was president and not well at all when Rutherford was president. So Conkling is one of the ones who's really pushing for Grant's nomination at the 1880 Republican Convention. Well, what did Grant think about all this? He said, I'm not a candidate for anything, and if the Chicago Convention nominates a candidate who can be elected, it will gratify me, and the gratification will be greater if it should be someone other than myself. Note in there, he didn't say, I'm not running, or don't put me up for nomination. hoping someone else, but again, he wasn't putting a stop to this. So when they get to the 1880 Republican convention, there's really three frontrunners at the time, Grant being one of them, along with William Sherman of Ohio and James Blaine of Maine. Well, those three had very strong followings, and ballot after ballot, 10 ballots, 20, 30, there's basically no movement in any of them. And all of a sudden, on the 34th ballot, a new name is thrown into the mix. James Garfield of Ohio. Longtime congressman, former Civil War general, just become a senator-elect in Ohio. His name is in the mix, and all of a sudden there is a stampede for Garfield to break this deadlock. 2 ballots later, he goes over the top and gets the nomination. It's interesting to note that all of his votes, though, came from Sherman and Blaine. Grant's people never wavered. From the very first ballot until the final ballot, 36 in all, he had just over 300 votes on every single ballot. But despite all that, there would be no third term for Ulysses Grant. The next example of flirting with the third term, we now move into the early 20th century. Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt becomes president in 1901 after the death of William McKinley, the assassination of William McKinley. Roosevelt finishes off the 3 years of his term and then wins his own 4-year term in 1904. The night of the election in 1904, everyone's celebrating, and Roosevelt actually makes an announcement that shocks people. Roosevelt said that the wise custom which limits the president to 2 terms regards the substance and not the form, and under no circumstances will I be a candidate for and accept the nomination for another. Wasn't going to run again, according to Roosevelt. He spends 7.5 years in the White House. He loves being president. He's very popular. Could easily have won again in 1908, but he said, no, I made a pledge. I'm not running. He has his handpicked successor, William Taft, who wins the presidency, and Roosevelt decides to go out of the country, goes off to Africa with his son on a 1-year African safari. He comes back to the United States, and there's a lot of noise about President Taft. People are not happy. Roosevelt's supporters, the progressives, are saying, look, Taft is too conservative. He's not progressive enough. He's been betraying many of the principles that you stood for. Roosevelt, you got to get back in the game and run again. Well, Roosevelt is thinking about this, not taking any steps immediately, but he starts getting out there, hearing from more and more people, starts giving speeches, realizes that he's popular. Maybe he is the right leader at this point in time. In fact, he says about Taft at this point, I'm really sorry for Taft. I'm sure he means well, but he means well feebly, and he does not know how. He is utterly unfit for leadership, and this is a time when we need leadership. Well, what about Roosevelt's previous pledge not to seek a nomination or an election for a third term? Well, in his autobiography, he rationalizes how he didn't really mean it exactly that way. In his autobiography, he says the third term tradition has no value whatever except as it applies to a third consecutive term. While it is well to keep it as a custom, it would be a mark of both weakness and unwisdom for the American people to embody it into a constitutional provision, which could not do them good, and on some given occasion might work real harm. So a bit of a warning there for the future. He was in this race to run again. He runs against Taft for the Republican nomination. It's sort of a nasty thing as a bunch of people in the primary start flocking to Roosevelt, but the old guard Republicans really rally around Taft. Taft wins the nomination. Roosevelt cries foul. In fact, he cries fraud. He goes across town with his supporters, and they're ready to form a new party. In fact, he tells his supporters, if you wish me to make the fight, I will make it. They form the Progressive Party, also called the Bull Moose Party, and he's off and running. Again, a nasty campaign where history shows us, though, that these things typically don't work, these third-party runs. What typically happens is the third-party candidate breaks the party that he historically had come from, and that's exactly what happened here in 1912. Roosevelt by getting in the race, fractured the Republican Party, basically handed power to his real political rival, which was the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. All of this aside, despite a very determined effort by Theodore Roosevelt, there would be no third term for TR. Now, the biggest surprise, perhaps, in this third term flirtation actually had to do with Woodrow Wilson. Why a surprise for Wilson? He completes his second term. Toward the end of that second term, he's actually been an invalid for the last year. He has this massive stroke the year before. He's barely functioning at all, almost a country without a president, but he believes so strongly that he was the only person who could get the League of Nations passed in the United States that he might actually have to run in 1920. Wilson said, everyone seems to be opposed to my running, but there may be practically a universal demand for the selection of someone to lead them out of the wilderness. Well, this was pretty delusional, and even his doctor Cary Grayson, a very close friend of Wilson, knew it. He knew this was out of the question. Grayson told a party operative that no matter what others may tell you, no matter what you may read about the president being on the road to recovery, I tell you that he is permanently ill physically, is gradually weakening mentally, and cannot recover. He couldn't possibly survive the campaign. Well, Wilson at the nominating convention in 1920, did anybody put his name up there? There were 44 ballots in all, 34 candidates for this wide open race that eventually went to James Cox. Did Wilson get a vote? Actually, he got 2. On one ballot, the 22nd ballot, 2 votes. Other than that, nobody took this seriously for Woodrow Wilson. Clearly, there would be no third term for him. Cox lost in the general election to Warren Harding that many in fact saw as a negative referendum on the last term of Woodrow Wilson. Now, 2 other examples of note on this topic in the 20th century from a couple of people who could have gone for a third term and decided not to. The circumstances, first of all, one in the 1920s was Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge took over for Harding when Harding died in 1923. He finished off his term, won his own term in 1924, and a lot of people thought he easily could win again in 1928. He was popular and the country was doing great. The economy roaring in the 1920s, so what would Coolidge do? Well, he decided he's not running. The year before the nominating conventions, he's on vacation in South Dakota. He calls the reporters in, and a surprise to everyone, he hadn't really talked to anybody about this, but he handwrites a note. It's handed out to the reporters that says, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. A lot of people kept questioning, really? You're not going to run? Why? And he kept insisting, "I am not running." Why? Well, he said, if I should serve as president again, I should serve almost 10 years, which is too long for a president in this country, going back to that precedent set by George Washington. So no third term for Calvin Coolidge. One other example, though, also possible, was Harry Truman. Now, the 22nd Amendment passed when Truman was president of the United States, but there was a clause in it, in the amendment itself, that said the incumbent president was exempted from this new prohibition. It would not go into effect until the next president is elected. So Truman, who had taken over for Roosevelt in 1945, finished off 3 years of his term, won his own term in 1948, had a decision to make in 1952. What was he going to do? Well, first thing was he talked about that amendment, and he did not like it. According to Truman, because it restricts the presidency and thwarts the right of the people to choose any president they desire. This amendment is a monstrosity, one of the worst ever added to the Constitution. Does that mean that he was going to run? No, it did not. He said he had done enough. He wrote, in fact, "I shall not be a candidate for re-election. I have served my country long, and I think efficiently and honestly. I shall not accept a renomination. I do not feel it is my duty to spend another 4 years in the White House." Truman was the last who was eligible for a third term, beginning with Dwight Eisenhower all the way to the present. As far as we know, there's no president who has had 2 terms that has actually seriously thought about a third. Is that changing right now? Well, for that, we'll have to wait and see. That is a look at presidents flirting with a third term. And for more on some of these stories, you can check out some of the links in the description to other Presidential Chronicles videos on some of these topics. You can check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Perspectives from Presidential Chronicles.